wasn't pressing a button deeply enough to initiate the camera or the video on the camera, and it would retract and shut off. Now, to continue with the story, a trip out of town. A little better than halfway through. This is our first story in my collection of science fiction stories, tales of the bizarre and unnatural. Now, in the alley, he worked quickly to fasten the trailer frame to the bicycle's rear axle. As soon as he was done, he startled the bicycle and coasted experimentally from the alley onto a side street, getting accustomed to the extra weight and drag. He went back the way he had come through the residential areas. By now there was full daylight, and as he passed along the silent streets and the large attractive homes with their lush green lawns, he sometimes had to veer around a stalled car or pickup truck. On one occasion he swung around a UPS truck and could hear someone in the back slicing open a cardboard box with a knife. Now and again he would see a man with a backpack, probably on his way to the nearest supermarket to forage for food. He himself would need to make another trip before he journeyed out of town. 10 minutes later he came to a stop in front of his garage and lowered the bicycle to the pavement, tilting the trailer along with it. He crawled through the gap beneath the partially open door, scrambled up to his feet once inside, and dug out an old chair he had stored among some boxes along the wall. He put the chair underneath the electric motor, which normally engaged a loop of chain which pulled a flange back and forth along a metal track. The flange was attached to a metal bar. The flange was attached by a metal bar to the top center of the door and held in place with a cotter pin. Using a pair of pliers, Blair removed this pin, thus freeing the door from the useless electric motor. Now, with comparatively little effort, Blair pulled the door up and propped it open with a push broom. He then rolled the bicycle into the garage and out of sight from any would-be thieves. With the garage door once more completely closed, Blair ran up to his apartment to fetch the backpack he'd kept around from his college days. Although the straps were a bit frayed, it was still serviceable. He hurried back outside and started off toward the supermarket. As before, he kept to the residential streets for as long as possible. In a few of the backyards which he passed were vegetable gardens with 2 or 3 rows of corn, sprawling squash vines, bushy tomato plants, and so on. From the sight of these gardens, an idea began to grow in Blair's mind concerning his own future welfare. Once deep into the countryside, Blair could foresee he would have only a couple of weeks at most before his food supplies were depleted. He had at most about 2 weeks to find a viable situation for himself before his food supplies were completed. Jesus. A place to stay where he would at least be tolerated, if not exactly welcomed. His chances of acceptance would be greatly enhanced, providing he had something to offer apart from his willingness and ability to perform manual labor. And now he imagined that a wide assortment of vegetable seeds might serve as a kind of down payment in exchange for food and shelter. Some farmer might just be receptive to such an offer. At least this was Blair's hope. So an electro-magnetic pulse has wiped out all machinery and equipment, since nowadays most, if not all, machinery and equipment produced in the factories have computer chips in them for these additional controls, shall we say. Now, these appliances worked perfectly fine in the past without these computer chips. You didn't have to program them, you just pushed levers and buttons and so on. And they operated mechanically, like a toaster, for example. I mean, that's a fairly simple appliance, and yet now it's almost as though you have to program a bloody toaster. It's ridiculous. Anyway. So that is a major vulnerability of present-day society, because just about everything we use and depend on has one of these computer chips in them for its operation and function. So, in theory, an electromagnetic pulse from the sun of sufficient energy could permanently, or at least for a significant period of time, wipe out all electronics everywhere. Just like that. And that's the premise for this story, by the way. All right, let's get on with it. He reached the supermarket around mid-morning, having already passed a number of people along the sidewalk who were pushing away shopping carts filled with canned food, boxes of dry cereal, jars of pickled vegetables, and in some instances cases of beer and bottles of wine and liquor. Each of them looked harried and apprehensive. No doubt they had quite a tussle back at the grocery store. Blair stepped through the entrance littered with shattered glass. The air brimmed with a stench of spilled liquid detergents and broken wine bottles. It bristled with shouts of warnings, cries, and shrieks. Some people who were pushing shopping carts rammed angrily into one another as they attempted to navigate through the crowd. Blair had to dodge out of the way of someone intent on pushing his cart out the door. Recovering his balance, he rushed through one aisle after another with his backpack now in hand, stuffing into it whatever he could grab while wrestling his shoulders between others, snatching out a few cans of tuna, another sack of beans, a bag of pancake mix. On his way out, he went through the liquor aisle, which had been all but stripped clean. Spotting an intact bottle wedged underneath the bottom shelf, he bent down and yanked it free, a quart of Canadian whiskey, and squirreled that into the backpack as well, thinking it might be useful in a barter session later on. Outside was the clear blue sky of an early September day. Blair quickly got his arms through the straps of the backpack and began to hike toward a nursery about 3 miles away. An hour later, he approached the nursery's storefront, which was crowded with a long array of young trees growing out of large pots. He found the entrance among all this foliage and followed a wooden ramp to a door which was propped invitingly open. No need to toss a stone through the window, it seemed to say. Blair went in. The place appeared to be deserted, which Blair found more than agreeable after the free-for-all and pandemonium at the supermarket. He had never been to this store before, unlike the sporting goods store, and he wasn't sure where to look for packets of vegetable seeds. But soon he found a trio of revolving racks near the checkout area, filled with an assortment of seed packets for flowers and vegetables. As he was tossing one packet after another into his backpack, he caught a movement out of the corner of his eye and jerked his head up to see a young woman dressed in jeans in a white blouse standing a few feet away from them. A swath of purple bruising lay beneath one of her eyes and also around the corner of her mouth. "You're the first person who's bothered to come in here," she said. Suddenly he realized she was the one who had been raped near his apartment building, the one to whom he'd offered help. "Later on, these will be a good thing to have," he said. "Did you work here before the world ended?" "Yes, I was the assistant manager. I couldn't stand hiding out in my apartment." Damn it. "Any longer as I came back, and so I came back to the greenhouse. There's still a sense of peace in this place, don't you think?" "Yes, I suppose there is," he said, looking at the several long, orderly rows of potted plants nearby. He turned his gaze back to her and asked, "Well, what do you plan to do?" "Funny you should ask. There isn't much we can do, is there?" It wasn't a question. "Get as far away from the city as possible, for one thing," he said. "I think I'll just go ahead and starve in the comfort of my apartment." A moment passed as they continued to hold one another's gaze, Blair thinking she seemed remarkably unafraid. "Are you on your own?" "Pretty much," she said. "Look, things are going to get a lot worse here. Tomorrow I'm heading out on a bicycle. You could come with me if you like." "I'm going to stay, thanks just the same." "Okay," he said, uncertain whether he felt disappointed or relieved. "I'll just grab a few more of these and be on my way." "Be my guest," she said. Then she walked back among the rows of the greenhouse and disappeared. After a sleepless night, Blair rose early the next morning, splashed cold water on his face, dressed, and gathered all his provisions together into the backpack and carried this along with a sleeping bag and a small suitcase downstairs and out to the garage. Once more, he propped the garage door open with the push broom and set about arranging the backpack and the rest of his gear within the bicycle trailer's large duffel bag. He then returned to his apartment for the last time to fetch his winter coat, gloves, cap, and boots. But before gathering these out of the closet, he paused in front of the bookcase. He would take just one book with him. Yet which one? His gaze raced across the titles until he came to an anthology of American short stories his ex-wife had once given him as a birthday present. That would do as well as any, he thought. He used the coat as a makeshift sack to carry everything else and hurried out to the garage. He stuffed the coat and its contents into the duffel bag and zipped the bag closed, then pushed the bicycle out onto the paved drive which ran past the apartment buildings. Feeling as though he was about to dive off a cliff into a deep lake, Blair, gripping the handlebars, gave the bike a little shove forward and quickly straddled the seat and set off. Presently, along the outskirts of the city, he turned onto a road which wound down the side of a steep valley to the highway below. Now and again he had to swerve around an abandoned vehicle. Once he passed an elderly man who stood next to the barrel pit, his mouth agape, his incredulous eyes following Blair down the road. A short while later, at the valley floor, Blair crossed over a short bridge onto a divided highway strewn with stalled-out cars, pickups, freight trucks. The initial chaos must have been grim, he thought. But now no one seemed to be around, and this stretch of the highway, still close to the city, had the eerie appearance of a narrow wrecking yard. He took the southbound direction which led away from town, pedaling between the two lanes, thus avoiding the derelict vehicles. Even though he was anxious to get away from the city as soon as possible, he knew perfectly well that he could not expend himself in some frantic all-out sprint, and so he was resigned to a slow, methodical passage up out of the valley, out of the pine forests, and into a region of farmland dominated by rolling hills. By midday, Blair had traveled close to 30 miles. Recently harvested wheat fields covering the hills lay in all directions. Tired, thirsty, hungry, he steered the bicycle onto a connecting county road and followed a few hundred feet until he reached a clump of willows growing along a narrow creek. He rested a while beneath the shade of the trees and drank some water from a gallon milk container he filled shortly before leaving the apartment. After quenching his thirst, he rummaged through the backpack and found the box of granola bars he'd managed to snatch away amid the rest of the looting crowd at the supermarket. And get the next page. For hell's sake. And tore the box open. He took out two of the individually wrapped bars and then returned the box to the backpack and replaced this inside the trailer's duffel bag. He forced himself to eat the food slowly, savoring each sweet, crunchy bite. In a few days, he would only have rice and beans to sustain himself. Overhead, a pair of magpies swooped into the upper reaches of the trees and began to harangue Blair with their strident, repetitive calls. He looked up at the birds and smiled grimly to himself. Maybe they've got a nest up there, he thought. After finishing his meal, he lay back on the tall, cool grass beneath the willows and closed his eyes. Presently, the magpies fell silent and left him in peace. And all he heard now were the leaves of the willows stirred by the wind. How did I do this? Oh, yes. Okay. A little housekeeping. I was much more of a slob when I was younger. After 2 marriages, though, that jump becomes domesticated. And I suppose I've become domesticated. Yes, it's legal to smoke marijuana in the state of Washington. What do you know about that? The state of Washington, one of the most progressive states in the country, and one that will oppose these Supreme Court decisions within the framework of legality, of course. Governor Inslee said as much. Of course, I voted for the man. His father was a science teacher, you know, in public schools, high school. Or junior high, I'm not sure which. Makes no difference. So I guess Inslee went into law, and then he went into politics and kept winning elections. Became the governor of the state. Now he's in his second term, I think. Right? Second term. Well, I've got a half an hour, so I better get on with it. Later, he woke with a sudden jerk and sat up. For a moment he listened intently, hearing nothing, jumped to his feet. He stepped slowly away from the trees and looked out toward the highway. He kept looking for a while, then, satisfied no one was about, he raised the bicycle up onto its wheels and rolled it back up to the road. A moment later he was back on the highway, continuing along the course he had settled upon the previous night while studying his maps of the Northwest. About an hour later he saw them. Up ahead in the distance, 4 riders on bicycles in single file were climbing the next hill. Of course, he knew that he would not be the only one leaving the city. Nonetheless, he now felt suddenly robbed of the sense of security his solitude had been providing. For the next several miles, the distance between himself and the other cyclists neither grew nor diminished. Presently he came to the junction where he would begin to take a series of secondary highways into Idaho's northern panhandle. He paused there for a brief rest. Watching the others draw further and further away, as he wondered where they planned to go, Oregon perhaps, or even Southern California. Blair's tentative destination was the rural environs of Idaho, where, he believed, he could minimize his encounters with other people. Not a particularly trusting soul in this situation, nor had he ever been. About an hour later, unlike the previous highway, which often cut straight through a hillside at the cost of considerable excavation, the lesser road Blair now traveled snaked around the bottom of these same hills, greatly reducing the amount of work he had to expend with his legs. After a short while, having come across only a few abandoned vehicles, he noticed along the ridge of some distant hills an incongruous row of tall white windmills, wind turbines. Their 3-pronged blades slowly yet steadily revolving and producing electricity, if any, which no one would be able to use. Not much later, he passed a grain storage facility. A pair of massive cone-shaped piles of wheat were heaped in front of the towering grain elevators, all of them apparently filled to capacity. Now, none of this wheat would ever be transported, and after a few rainstorms, those outdoor piles would turn into mountains of mold. From time to time, he would pass a farmhouse, and a dog, sometimes a pair of dogs, would race out onto the road and chase after him, forcing Blair to exert all his strength to speed the bicycle away and escape being bitten on the leg. After this had happened the first time, the dog finally having given up and retreated, he stopped to catch his breath and realized that he would need a heavy stick to use as a club. Later on, he came upon a pickup truck, rendered useless like all the other vehicles. There happened to be a load of junk in the back, which he scrounged through and was lucky enough to find a piece of water pipe about 2 feet long. He also found the remainder of the spool of stiff insulated wire, which he uncoiled and fit through the pipe, twisting together the 2 ends into a makeshift strap. With this weapon now looped around his bicycle handlebar, he set off once more. The very next farm he approached turned out to have a particularly swift-footed dog, which charged out after him when he drew alongside the graveled entrance to the property. Blair's heart leaped, and he stood on the pedals, churning his legs to the utmost, yet the dog continued to advance upon him. With no other recourse, he freed the pipe from the handlebars and walloped the dog across its muzzle. The dog emitted a series of yelps as it twisted away and ran back a few steps and then stopped, panting for breath, and watched as Blair moved further and further into the distance. Late that afternoon, the sun low along the western horizon and the air beginning to cool, Blair decided to make camp just off the road along the edge of a wheat field which had been recently harvested. He set up his small tent and then went off towards some nearby pine trees to gather up a few branches for a fire. He soon returned with an armload of branches that he'd managed to snap into pieces and dumped them on the ground next to the tent. With the dry grass and twigs beneath the larger sticks, the fire ignited quickly after Blair touched it off with a disposable pocket lighter. He thought uneasily that this lighter would only last so long. And then what? Surely in the small towns that he was going to pass through up ahead, there would be a gas station or a grocery store where he could find a pocket lighter or a book of matches. He cut a potato into small pieces and used a small amount of oil to cook them in a frying pan. Then when the potatoes were nearly done, he added a few slices of roasted pork. The smell of the cooking food teased his hunger. Soon he removed the frying pan from the low fire, set it on the ground between his legs, and greedily ate his meal. Later at dusk, as he stared at the dwindled fire's glowing embers and tried to peer into the days ahead, his mind gradually filled with hopeful imaginings of occasional benign encounters with rural folk, some of which might even turn welcoming. In a very real sense, he had to believe this could happen, for otherwise his slow passage through the countryside would simply cease on the day that weakness from starvation had finally immobilized him. Then his thoughts returned to those two enormous piles of wheat and from the grain elevators he had passed earlier in the day. He laughed aloud, realizing that such a stockpile could easily sustain thousands of people through the winter months and even the warmer months ahead. The seed could be boiled into gruel, if nothing else. Why, it could be crushed by hand into flour, or some clever farmer could build an animal-powered machine that would do the job. As dusk turned to night and the darkness overhead filled with stars, Blair unfurled his sleeping bag and fit himself into it. The ground was lumpy, but he was so tired he hardly noticed. He stared at the dying coals of the fire and bit longer, then closed his eyes and soon fell asleep. After breakfast, the same as his supper of the previous night, and now once again pedaling along the road, Blair was just outside the town of Oaksdale, its population sign declaring the number of residents at 422. As he entered the town, he gazed for a moment at a large, old, weather-beaten building 4 stories tall, its exterior walls consisting of long, gray wooden planks, an architectural relic from another era. Next appeared a few brick buildings, some of which thought Blair could have been constructed in the early 20th century. Unlike the city swarming with looters, hooligans, or merely the disoriented, this little town appeared nearly deserted. A pair of young boys stood on the sidewalk next to a grocery store and looked at him with open curiosity. A man wearing a baseball cap sat on a chair in front of another building with a rifle laying across his lap. He glared at Blair with a look of distrust and resentment but said nothing. Further along the streets, a group of men had gathered in front of a gas station where someone had inserted a hose through a small opening in the pavement. The hose ran up to a hand-cranked device resting on a chair. One man was methodically turning the crank while another stood by as gasoline poured into a red plastic tank he was holding against his thigh. As if on cue, they all glanced in Blair's direction and watched him pass.